So I'd like to speak this afternoon about some of the most fundamental and also critical aspects of the Buddha's teachings, which is the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. So I'm sure that these are topics which are already somewhat familiar to many people. However, because they form the backbone of the Buddha's teachings and the most concise summation and formulation of the Buddha's teachings, it's really worth coming back to them again and again and really examining just what it is that's being said here, what the implications these teachings have for our lives, and how we can apply them, how we can use them as a guideline to self-development, as guidelines for examining the ways that we think, act, and speak. As was mentioned, I'll speak for a little while, and then we can have some discussion around these points. But just to start with the Four Noble Truths, the first Noble Truth is the truth that life is not always satisfying. Life is not 100% satisfying all the time. Sometimes in life we experience sadness, sorrow, dejection, anguish, irritation. Sometimes we don't get what we want. Sometimes we get things that we don't want. Sometimes we lose people or friends that we like. Sometimes we have to deal with people that we don't like. So these are just some examples of some of the very basic aspects of our experience as human beings, which is that we are not perfectly happy all the time. We occasionally experience things which are upsetting or irritating, things which cause us distress or discomfort of various sorts. So this first noble truth, this truth of the unsatisfactoriness of life, this is sometimes rendered somewhat less usefully as saying life is suffering, but that's not actually what the Buddha said. The Buddha didn't say life is suffering. Rather, what he said is that there is suffering. There is dissatisfaction. So this is a distinctly different statement. Rather, it's saying that our experiences are characterized by a tendency to be unsatisfying. So this is a distinctly different statement. So again, it's not necessarily that there's anything wrong with the experiences themselves, but rather it's that our reactions to, the ways that we respond and deal with the experiences that we have leads to our own dissatisfaction. So this becomes a bit more clear with the second noble truth. So the second noble truth is the cause of dissatisfaction, the cause of suffering. And the Buddha states quite succinctly that the cause of suffering is desire. So what is it that makes us dissatisfied? What is it that makes us upset, confused, irritated, angry? What is it that causes this? Very simply, it's because we want things to be a certain way. We want certain kinds of experiences. We want certain possessions. We want certain friends. We want certain ideas or emotions. And since much of life, much of our experiences, much of the outside world is outside of our control, is beyond our control, then simply put, we don't always get what we want. So maybe you want to have a Camaro and you want to be a millionaire and you want to have a beautiful partner and you want to have whatever it is you want, respect, fame, doesn't matter. Well, I'm sorry to inform you that life is not always going to work that way. You're not always going to get things exactly the way you wish you could. And often it boils down to even dealing with much less grandiose forms of desire, like simply when we feel pain, when we feel physical pain, which is an inescapable aspect of human life. As a human, with a body, a physical body, your physical body will sometimes feel pleasant and sometimes unpleasant. Sometimes you'll feel pleasure, sometimes it will feel pain. This is normal. This is just goes along with having a physical body. So there's nothing wrong with that. There's no problem inherently in having pleasure and pain. The problem is that when we experience pain, we want it to stop, we want it to change, we want it to diminish, we want it to go away. And that's what makes us upset. That's what makes us distraught. That's what causes distress in the mind. It's not the sensation of pain itself that causes us mental distress, emotional distress. It's our wanting our experience to be something other than it is. It's wanting the pain to change and go away. That's what makes it so upsetting. Similarly, when we experience pleasant sensations, pleasant experiences, our tendency is that we want it to last. We want it to deepen. We want it to continue. We want it to be available all the time. We want it to be perfect. And again, these are unrealistic goals. These are unrealistic desires, because the nature of all experiences is that they are temporary. They come and they go. They change, they shift. So whatever pleasant experience we're having, whatever pleasant sensations we're experiencing, they're going to change. It's going to stop. It's going to become something different than it is. And once again, there's nothing wrong. That's not a problem. That's just the way things work. Everything is temporary. Everything is constantly changing. That's just a fundamental law of the universe. So what's the problem then? The problem is not with this tendency to change. The problem is with our tendency to expect things to not change. The problem is with this unrealistic assumption that I like this, I want this, it's going to last, it's going to remain. It's wanting that pleasant experience to be under our control. That's what causes us so much distress, because then when reality strikes home and we realize that pleasant experience we had is fading, it's going away, then we feel a sense of loss. We feel a sense of disturbance, a sense that there's something wrong. But ultimately, there's nothing wrong. The problem here is simply that we want reality to be different than it is. So then the question becomes, so then what can we do? How can we stop getting upset and disturbed by the way the universe operates? How is it that we can stop being upset by these fundamental aspects of reality? And this leads directly into the third noble truth. The third noble truth is the cessation of dissatisfaction, the cessation of suffering. And once again, the Buddha says very clearly and succinctly, the cessation of suffering is the cessation of desire. The cessation of desire is the cessation of suffering. When there's no more wanting, there's no more hurting. It's really as simple as that. When we stop wanting experiences to be a particular way, when we stop wanting that which is inaccessible, that which is unrealistic, when we stop wanting the outside world to be under our control, when we stop wanting our experiences to be any particular way, then there's no more suffering. There's no more dissatisfaction. So again, to give a simple example, maybe right now you want a frothy cappuccino. Well, I'm sorry, we don't have that here right now. So you can either sit there and just roll around in your own grief and turmoil of, oh, if only I had a cappuccino, life would be so much better. I hate this place. No, that's not actually going to help anything. Instead, you just drop your desire for a cappuccino. And suddenly there's no problem. As simple as that. You just drop the desire and the suffering's gone with it. Wasn't that easy? So that's the third noble truth. The recognition that happiness and contentment are not dependent upon any particular external conditions. They're dependent entirely upon our own attitude. It's entirely our own perspective. It's how we use our mind that determines whether we're happy or sad, whether we're content or upset. It's not the outside world. It's not what we have or don't have. That's not what makes us happy. Happiness then instead is dependent upon the inclination of our own mind, which is something that is fully within our own control. So this starts to give us an inkling of the power of the Buddha's teachings, because what this is indicating is that we actually have full power over our experience. Not in terms of changing the external conditions, but rather by changing our internal reactions and responses to those conditions. We have the power to always be happy and content regardless of what we experience. And this makes us completely immune to the vicissitudes of life. This makes us completely immune to all the troubles of life, all the turmoil of life. It's entirely in getting control of our reactive tendencies, in retraining our minds, retraining our habits, retraining our emotional patterns. So, then the question becomes, in practical terms, how can we do that? So it's one thing to lay out the principles. The principles are really simple. Drop desire, and there'll be no more suffering. It's really simple. The actual practice of integrating that into our lives can be a bit more complicated. Which is why, fortunately, the Buddha gave some very specific bits of advice on how we can go about achieving this. How we can change the way that we think, act, and speak to reduce our suffering, to reduce our obsessions, to reduce our tendency to get caught up in desire, to reduce our self-obsessiveness. And these techniques are encapsulated in the Noble Eightfold Path, which is what I'll go over next. So the first aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path is right perspective. In Pali, this is samma ditthi. So right perspective, correct understanding, appropriate worldview. And the Buddha speaks about right view in many different ways. So I won't go over the full scope of right view. If we had, say, 4 or 5 hours, maybe I could talk about right view in detail. But instead I'll give a brief statement about it. One of the most direct explanations of right view that the Buddha gives is quite simply the understanding that every single choice we make has a corresponding result. Most of us are familiar with this to some extent already, in that we might remember from physics the statement, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So every cause has a corresponding effect. Every action has a corresponding result. These are basic principles of causality, which, generally speaking, every reasonably sane person on the planet buys into. Without some basic faith in causality, life is effectively impossible to live. So, for example, you get in your car, and you put your key in the ignition, and you turn your key. And you expect the ignition to start the car. So cause, turn key, result, car starts. Cause, press foot on gas pedal. Result, car moves forward. This is just a basic understanding of cause and effect. We see it all the time. Cause, throw ball up in air. Result, ball falls back down. Very basic things which we can understand in physical terms. What the Buddha did, though, is he took this one step farther. And he said that these basic laws of causality apply not just to the physical universe, but also to the world of emotions and thoughts. So even when we make a mental choice, like we choose to be angry, or we choose to be kind, we choose to be friendly, or we choose to be hostile. Just these basic attitudes of mind that we establish are choices that we make. Those are actions that are taken, which inevitably produce a corresponding result. So this is what's commonly referred to as karma. So the word karma, or in Pali kamma, simply means action. It means what's done, what we do. So every karma, every action produces a vipaka, a result. This is simply what's being said. So unfortunately, the word karma is used in many different ways these days, much of which don't really have anything to do with what the Buddha meant by the word. So karma these days is used to mean fate or destiny or luck or fortune, coincidence. And this has nothing to do with what the Buddha was talking about. When the Buddha was talking about karma, again, what he was referring to is this inevitable result that comes from every intentional choice we make. So every single action produces a corresponding result. The Buddha also clarified further that, particularly in the domain of karma, in order for an action to produce a result, it must be intentional. So people often give the example of, well, what if I'm walking around and I accidentally step on an ant? Is that bad karma? Does that produce some harmful result for me in the future? And from the Buddhist perspective, the answer is no, because it wasn't intentional. You didn't do it on purpose. It was an accident. You weren't actually trying to hurt or kill anything, so it doesn't produce the corresponding harmful result. You might be being negligent, and negligence produces its own result, but you weren't actually trying to kill something. That was an accident. So again, this is one of the most direct formulations of right view, is the recognition of causality. The recognition that every single choice we make matters. Every single choice we make creates a corresponding result. And depending on how you look at it, this is either horrifying or incredibly liberating, because it again points to the truth that we ultimately have full control over our own experience. Do you want good things to happen to you? Then do good things to others. Do you want bad things to happen to you? Then do bad things. It's really as simple as that. So once again, it gives us the power to shape our own lives, to determine the course of our own lives. It's entirely in the choices that we make. So if we make wholesome choices, then we get good results, happy results, peaceful results, enjoyable, pleasant results. If we make unwholesome choices, then we experience unpleasant results. So the next element of the Noble Eightfold Path is right attitude. So in Pali, this is samma sankappa. And the Buddha identifies three particular examples of right attitude. The first one is so the attitude of a non-harming, the thought of non-harming, the intention of non-harming. So again, not wishing harm on any living being. This includes yourself, by the way. So some people have a self-sacrificial mentality, this martyr mentality of giving up themselves for the sake of others, and that's not actually encouraged in Buddhism. You are also a living being. You are also worthy of compassion and love and respect. So it's important to have compassion for oneself as well as for others. So again, non-harming is the first example of right attitude, which is samma sankappa in Pali, for those who are keeping track. The second one is the attitude of non-cruelty. So this goes closely hand in hand with the first one. So again, not having any cruel thoughts or intentions of cruelty towards any living being. And the third one is the attitude of renunciation. And this one takes a bit of explanation, because for many people, renunciation is a very scary word. They think it means they need to sell off all their possessions and give all their money to the poor and live in a cardboard box or something. That's not actually renunciation. And that can be a form of renunciation, but that's not really the purpose. That's not really the attitude that this is talking about. So rather, the attitude of renunciation is the willingness to let go of anything you own. It comes from the recognition that our happiness is not dependent upon our possessions. So normally people tend to think that their happiness is based upon how much money they have and how nice their car is and what kind of clothing they wear and what kind of food they eat and how many kids they have or don't have, what their partner is like. People tend to think their happiness is based upon what they own, what they possess. But the truth is that all of our possessions are temporary, like everything else. Every single thing that we own, and that includes our relationships with other people, by the way, every single thing that we own is subject to being parted from us. We might lose anything that we have at any moment. Some of you might think you own a car, and you might think your car is parked outside right now. But when you leave this room and go out there, your car might not be there. So how would that make you feel? We'll find out soon enough. We can always call the sheriff if we have to. Anyway, you might go outside and find your car is not there. So how does that make you feel? Usually people get very upset when these things happen, because they think that their happiness is dependent upon that possession of theirs. So this attitude of renunciation is the willingness to let go of anything you own. The recognition that every single thing you have is temporary. In a very real sense, it was never yours to begin with. It was just a condition which happened to come about and will eventually cease to be. Ultimately, you will lose everything you own anyway, eventually. If nothing else, at some point you're going to die, and at that point you leave all your stuff behind when that happens. So this attitude of renunciation is the recognition then that when we lose things, that's okay. There's nothing wrong. It doesn't need to bother us. Or to put it in different terms, we don't need to bother ourselves when we lose things. We don't need to upset ourselves when we lose things. We don't need to make ourselves sad or angry or disturbed when we lose things. Because it's not the loss of the thing that upsets us. We upset ourselves. We choose to be upset. And we use the loss of that possession or the loss of that person as the excuse for indulging in that emotion or that mind state. So this is a habit that we tend to have. It's a tendency that tends to be buried in our subconscious. So we often feel like it's an automatic reaction. Like somebody steals your bag and we think the automatic reaction is to get angry. But it's actually not automatic. We do have a choice. We do have the ability to stop ourselves from reacting in those habitual ways. We do have the ability to remain calm, clear, and content, regardless of what happens to us. It's simply a matter of closely watching those reactive tendencies and choosing not to engage in them, choosing not to participate in these negative, harmful habits that we've been carrying around for our whole lives. So it's a few words on the second aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path. The next few start to get into the domain of morality and ethics. So the third one is right speech. So looking at the ways that we interact with others verbally. And the Buddha identifies a few forms of verbal conduct that are particularly destructive, particularly harmful. So lying should be a familiar example. Lying, divisive speech, so like malicious gossip, harsh speech, speaking in ways that are distinctly unpleasant to others. These are some very clear examples. Useless speech, so just frivolous chatter, wasting time. So after right speech, then the next element is right action. So this starts to get again into some more familiar territory. So some examples the Buddha gives of very harmful forms of actions that are best avoided are killing any living being, so not just humans. This also includes animals and insects. So respecting life. So just as we wish to be happy and healthy and alive, then we also respect the right of other living beings to be healthy and alive. We allow them to keep their life. So this means that when there's a spider in our room, we capture it and put it outside instead of squishing it. Just as we don't want some giant thing to squish us, we don't squish that spider. It has just as much right to live as we do. It has a mind, just like you. It has emotions, just like you. It feels pleasure and pain, just like you. So then we give it the same opportunity that we want, the same opportunity to be happy, healthy, and alive. Even if we don't like them, even if we think they're disgusting, well, that's not their fault. I mean, that's certainly not a good reason to kill something just because we don't like it, or just because we think it's gross, or we think it's invading our space. So again, not killing, a very familiar principle. And where the Buddha's coming from here, it's worth pointing out that when the Buddha talks about these moral issues, it's not from the standpoint of like some authority up in the sky saying like, you must do this, you must not do that. These are not commandments. These are not orders that the Buddha is giving. Rather, the Buddha is simply saying that these are choices that will always lead to your own harm. So the Buddha's not saying, don't kill. Rather, what the Buddha is saying is that if you choose to kill, it will inevitably make you miserable. To say nothing of the poor being that you've harmed. But it will make the killer miserable. The one who kills feels the painful result of their own choice. Sometimes this is immediate. Like very frequently, people who have killed, particularly killed other humans, they feel an enormous amount of remorse, regret, self-torment as a result of it. Even if they think they had a good reason for it, it still tends to torture the mind. Even in this lifetime, it tortures us. It's something that's very difficult to overcome. And the Buddha also says that then in future lives, the one who is killed tends to experience various kinds of physical limitations. They tend to have short lives, painful lives, difficult lives. But we don't even need to wait for future lives to see the painful results of these choices. We can see it in the psychological torment that we experience in this very life, right here and right now. So we refrain from killing and from these other unwholesome modes of conduct for our own sake, for our own happiness, for our own peace of mind, as well as for the peace of mind of others. So, not killing, that's a easily recognizable one. Not stealing is another example of right action. So just as we have possessions that we like and we want to keep, then we allow other people to keep what they possess, what they own. Not engaging in sexual misconduct. So this one also requires a bit of clarification. Particularly people who have grown up under other religions often have particular ideas of what sexual misconduct is. But it's somewhat different in Buddhism than it is in Christianity or Islam or many other world religions. So what the Buddha was primarily talking about when he spoke about sexual misconduct, first is taking somebody against their will. So rape is clearly sexual misconduct, very harmful form of behavior. Cheating on one's partner. So if one is in a committed relationship with another person, then breaking the trust of that relationship, cheating on that person, is a form of sexual misconduct. Again, it inevitably causes harm to everyone involved. Anyone who's been through a situation like that, of infidelity in a sexual relationship, can attest to how painful it is to be involved in those kinds of situations. So we strive to preserve a sense of mutual trustworthiness in our romantic relationships with others. Some things that it does not cover, however, which is different from a number of other religions. So in Buddhism, it's like premarital sex is not considered sexual misconduct. Homosexuality is not considered sexual misconduct. So these are things which are harshly condemned in some religions, but which the Buddha never identified as being worthy of note, never identified as being a cause of suffering. I mean, realistically, if we want to be serious, then any kind of sexual relationship is a recipe for heartache, turmoil, distress, disaster. So if we really want to be free of the distress that comes from such things, then celibacy makes life much simpler, much easier. But again, the Buddha was very realistic. The Buddha was very pragmatic, practical. So naturally he recognized that most people are not interested in celibacy. So instead he simply identified some of the most harmful forms of sexual behavior. So again, infidelity and rape are two extremely harmful forms of sexual behavior that are best avoided. And another example of right conduct is refraining from intoxicants. Refraining particularly from alcohol was something the Buddha specifically identified. But it also extends to medicines. With medicines, it's important to ask ourselves, why am I taking this medicine? Am I actually taking it for a medical reason? Am I taking it to treat a particular medical condition? Or am I just taking it because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy? Am I just taking it because it makes me feel good? Am I just taking it because it brings intoxication? So we do need to look at what it is we're doing with our mind, how it is that we're altering our mind. Because this is something that's directly relevant to our practice. So again, to take the example of alcohol, and this applies to many other intoxicants as well. Alcohol weakens mindfulness. It weakens our awareness, and it weakens our self-restraint. So it makes it more difficult to preserve our moment-to-moment practice. It makes it more difficult to preserve our virtuous conduct, to keep our mind clear of harmful, unwholesome mind states. It makes it harder to pay attention to what's going on. It makes it more difficult to observe with wisdom the nature of phenomena. So naturally, it runs directly counter to a number of fundamental Buddhist principles. And this is one that many people find particularly hard to swallow. And the reason for that is quite simple. It's because people like to be intoxicated. It feels good. It's fun. And I don't blame you. It is fun. But it is also the antithesis of Buddhist practice. It is very destructive to one's practice. So if we are still engaging in self-intoxication, inebriation, if we're still muddying and clouding our mind and our judgment, it's worth asking ourselves why. Why do we do this to ourselves? And it's worth considering that it might be worth stopping. It might be worth at least thinking about stopping. No pressure, just an idea. So moving on. Next we have right livelihood. This is the, fifth element of the Noble Eightfold Path. And this is a very big subject. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about it right now. I'm just going to paint some broad strokes. So again, the Buddha acknowledged that in order to survive in the world, we need to have some way of providing for ourselves. We need to have some way of getting food and clothing and shelter and medicine and so on. So most of us are involved in work of some kind. So then it becomes important to consider the effects of what we do for a living. What are the results? What impact do our choices have on the world? So we want to try to avoid engaging in any livelihood, in any kind of work that harms other living beings, either directly or indirectly. Also, anything that harms yourself would also fit under this category. So anything that harms living beings. So some clear examples the Buddha gives are any occupation that requires you to kill. So a hunter, wrong livelihood. Fisherman, fisherwoman, wrong livelihood. Hitman, wrong livelihood. Combat occupations in the military, wrong livelihood. This one is disturbing to some people because with the current state of international human society, it is frequently thought of as necessary to engage in military conflict. I would maintain that it is not necessary. It actually is possible to get along peacefully together. Nobody in the room is killing each other right now. So clearly, right here we have a clear example that it's possible to get by without killing each other. So I would maintain that it's actually not necessary to use military force in international diplomacy. And the Buddha clearly identified it as unwholesome, a form of wrong livelihood, a form of livelihood that causes harm to living beings. So I would, again, this is an indisputable example of wrong livelihood. So combat occupations in the military, working in a slaughterhouse, so slaughtering farm animals for food or any other reason, is clearly wrong livelihood. Professional thief, that's a wrong livelihood. There's a few other examples where it's more indirect. So dealing in weapons, selling poisons, selling intoxicants, dealing in slaves. These are all examples of indirectly, well actually slavery is pretty direct, but the others are examples of indirect harm being done to living beings. And there's many other examples which we can find littered throughout the canon, such as prison guard. There's I mean, I won't go into too many examples. It's more just a matter of really considering to yourself, does my work cause harm either directly or indirectly to living beings? And trying to minimize the amount of harm that we cause. It's difficult to completely eliminate indirect harm, but we can at least do the best we can to reduce it. So that's right livelihood. Next we have right effort. And right effort is an extremely important element of the Buddha's teachings. Again, I could talk for an hour or two just on right effort, but instead I'll give a short summary. Right effort is, so we constantly watch the mind. We're constantly paying attention to our thoughts and emotions. And we're constantly evaluating, is this thought or emotion that I'm currently experiencing, is it wholesome or unwholesome? Is it helpful or harmful? We're constantly asking ourselves this question. Is it good or bad? Wholesome or unwholesome? If we notice that there is a thought or emotion in our mind that is unwholesome, then we make an effort to remove it. This is one aspect of right effort. We also make an effort to prevent unwholesome mind states from arising. So when I say mind state, that encompasses both thoughts and emotions. The two are not clearly distinguished in Buddhist terminology. They're all just mental objects, mind states, objects of mind. So again, we make an effort to prevent unwholesome mind states from arising, to remove any unwholesome mind states that have arisen, and we make an effort to encourage wholesome mind states to arise, and we make an effort to support, maintain, develop, and perfect wholesome mind states that are already present. So as we're watching our mind, if we see anger, resentment, jealousy, craving, annoyance, contempt, if we see any of these kinds of mind states arising, then we recognize that is unwholesome. That is harmful. And we make an effort to remove it, to get rid of it, get it out of the mind. Instead, what we want to be developing are mind states like mindfulness, clear awareness in the present moment, compassion, friendliness, consideration, equanimity. These are some examples of wholesome mind states, very beneficial mind states, which lead to our own good and the benefit of others as well. So this is what we do all day long, every single moment that we're awake. We constantly watch the mind. We watch the mind for wholesome mind states, and we watch it for unwholesome mind states. And most importantly, we do what's appropriate. Once we identify an unwholesome mind state, we get rid of it right away. Stop participating in it. That's the first thing we do. When we recognize an unwholesome mind state, the first thing to do is stop making it worse. So you might recognize that you're sitting here thinking about, God, I really hate my boss. He's such a jerk. He's always saying the rudest things. And you're like, no, wait a minute. This is actually an unwholesome line of thought. This actually isn't doing me any good. In fact, it's just making me more upset. So the first thing to do is stop participating. Stop focusing on all these angry thoughts about your boss. Then the next thing is to try to remove the anger from your mind. So often, if we fully stop participating in a unwholesome mind state, then it will disappear on its own very quickly. It has its own particular momentum, but once we stop pushing it along, it fades very rapidly, almost instantaneously. If it doesn't fade right away, then it's time to take some more drastic measures. So the Buddha gives a number of examples. So if we're feeling anger or hostility, then we try to replace it with thoughts of friendliness, kindness, compassion. That's not the easiest thing to do in regard to the person or situation we were thinking about. So if you're caught up in anger towards your boss, it's very difficult to jump directly to friendly, kind thoughts about your boss. But you might pick somebody else, like pick your mom or your daughter or your sister or your brother or a dear friend or somebody who you can easily generate a feeling of kindness towards, a feeling of compassion and consideration towards. And that emotion then will simply replace the unwholesome emotion of anger or hatred or irritation. So that's one example. I could give many examples, but again, we don't have that much time right now. We can go into that in more detail later if people wish. So that's right effort. The next element, the seventh aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path, is right mindfulness. So these days, mindfulness has become a buzzword in modern culture. We see it cropping up all over the place. We see it turning up in psychology and psychotherapy. We see it being taught in schools and colleges. Like mindfulness. Mindfulness can help reduce your stress. Mindfulness can make you a more productive worker. Mindfulness can do this and do that. Well, that's all well and good. But it's important to, again, return to what is it that the Buddha himself said about mindfulness. It's also important to ask ourselves, what actually is mindfulness? What is it that we mean when we say that? So one of the problems that happens is that when a word becomes so heavily used, then we can get to a point where we just, we almost ignore it when we hear it. We don't actually think about it. We don't think about what it means or implies. So these days, the word mindfulness is bandied around so much that it almost doesn't register in our mind, which, by the way, is an indication of a lack of mindfulness. So what is mindfulness? In simple terms, mindfulness is clear awareness in the present moment. And in Buddhist terms, we usually talk about mindfulness of something, mindfulness of a particular object or subject. For example, mindfulness of the body, as we were practicing earlier this afternoon. So paying clear attention in the present moment to sensations of the body. That's an example of mindfulness. Right effort involves mindfulness of the mind, paying clear attention to the contents of the mind, the state of the mind, the mood of the mind. So that's another example of right mindfulness. And mindfulness is, again, a foundational aspect of the Buddha's path. Because without knowing what's going on right now, we can't do anything about it. We have to be fully aware of our present situation in order to know the most appropriate course of action. If you don't know what the problem is, you can't figure out a solution very easily. So we have to be fully aware in the present moment, because, by the way, you can never be fully aware in the past, because it's gone. You can't be fully aware in the present either, in the future either, because the future's not here yet. You can only ever be fully present right now. So in a very real sense, that's the most important time. It's right now. You might even say it's the only time, is right now. So it's bordering on ontology, and I don't really want to get into that right now. But suffice to say that our experience always happens right now. Our practice always happens right now. So our awareness must always be focused right now. So paying full attention to our experience in the present moment. So that's a few words on mindfulness. The final element of the Noble Eightfold Path to be spoken about is right concentration. So samadhi, collectedness of mind, focus of mind. And this is something which, again, is vitally important in Buddhist practice. Because, well, for many reasons. But one particularly important reason for this is because our normal state of mind tends to be scattered, dispersed, unfocused, unclear. We're not particularly present. We tend to dwell in a relatively superficial mode of thought. But if we really want to start to deal with our habitual tendencies, our our habits of reacting in particular ways to experiences, our habits of reacting with anger to certain phenomena, our tendencies of reacting with sadness or dejection to certain experiences, our tendencies of reacting with contempt or envy to certain experiences. In order to catch that in the act, in order to really notice that habit before it overcomes us, before it seizes control of our mind, we have to be able to focus the mind very clearly on our mental processes. We have to be able to see them very closely. So just as if you want to study microbes, then you need to get a microscope, turn up the power on the microscope and focus it in to notice these minute objects. In the same way, when we want to start to closely examine the mind, then we need to turn up the power on our mind. We need to focus the mind in so that we can very closely examine what's going on within us. So this is one reason why we develop concentration, as we were doing at the beginning of this session. So when we sit down and focus the mind on mindfulness of a particular object, like the body or the breath, then that tends to focus and clarify the mind, which allows us to much more easily examine our mental processes, to much more clearly notice where we start to fall into habitual reactions, where we start to get caught up in these habits and tendencies of mind, which cause us so much trouble and pain. And correspondingly, it allows us to respond in the most appropriate way. As we notice what's going on within us, then we can do what's going to lead us towards happiness and contentment, rather than falling in our old habits, which, generally speaking, lead to turmoil and distress. So this is the opportunity that the Buddha gives us, the opportunity that the Buddha describes for us, is the opportunity to take control of our mind, to take control of our own life, not in its external details, but in our internal responses, and to choose responses which lead to our own happiness and peacefulness. So those are a few words on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. At this time, we can have more of an open discussion. Yes, go for it.
What happens to individuals who are born with mental illnesses like bipolar depression? What are they supposed to do to control their minds?
The techniques are still basically the same. It's still basically the same stuff that anybody else uses. So these days there's a lot of focus on ideas of mental disorder and mental illness. So like currently the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is used in modern Western psychology and psychotherapy, identifies close to 400 semi-distinct mental disorders. But the truth is that everybody who's not enlightened is insane. So we're all crazy. It's just that some people it's a bit more obvious than with others. Yes.
I have a question about calmer. About calmer. You said a lot of really amazing things, but if you don't know the problem, you can't be aware of the solution. And when it comes to right view,
Uh-huh.